untouched. That word is doing a lot of work right now, and we need to understand why. August 612 BCE, the city of Nineveh burns. The Babylonian Chronicle, a clay tablet currently sitting in the British Museum under accession number BM 21901, records the entire event in 14 lines of cuneiform. 14 lines for the capital of the largest empire the world had yet seen. The text reads simply, "The city was turned into a ruin heap." The people who wrote that tablet were the victors. For the next 2,600 years, every history textbook worked from the Babylonian version of events. Assyria fell, Assyria ended, move on. Except the genome didn't move on. There is no collapse signal in Assyrian autosomal DNA around 609 BCE, no sudden influx of Babylonian ancestry, no median genetic fingerprint, no bottleneck indicating a population crash. What Dr. Lazaridis and his team's 2022 science data shows, across 777 ancient genomes and thousands of modern comparison samples, is the same northern Mesopotamian Neolithic genetic profile continuing straight through the imperial period and beyond it, without interruption. The empire fell, the people contracted northward, they moved into the Hakkari mountains of southeastern Turkey and the Urmia basin of northwestern Iran, and they closed the door behind them. And here's where it gets strange. The Hakkari mountains are not strategic terrain. They are hiding terrain. Steep, cold, almost impossible to administer, centuries away from any census. A 2015 mtDNA study of Assyrian Hakkari highlanders found that even within the broader Assyrian genetic cluster, while the mountain population had maintained its own distinct signature, notably higher frequencies of specific mtDNA haplogroups compared to diaspora Assyrians. Isolation inside isolation. A fortress built inside a fortress. The Hakkari Assyrians ran themselves for 26 centuries under a hereditary patriarch called the Mar Shimun, a lineage that survived unbroken from the early Christian era all the way to March 1918. That is when Mar Shimun XIX Benjamin was shot by Kurdish tribal leader Simko Shikak at Dilmun in northwestern Iran during peace negotiations under a flag of truce. His death triggered a forced displacement of more than 70,000 mountain Assyrians toward British lines in Mesopotamia. The same mountains that hid the post-imperial Assyrians for 2,600 years became, in the 20th century, the killing ground. But step back to the larger picture for a moment. The Neo-Assyrian Empire ran the ancient world's first documented mass deportation program. They moved Israelites, Elamites, Aramaeans, Babylonians, whole cities relocated across the empire. Their own records list an estimated 4.4 million people resettled between the 9th and 7th centuries BCE. They moved everyone they absorbed, and somehow kept their own genome perfectly still. That is not survival. That is a policy. And here is what no textbook has asked yet. The policy was older than the empire itself. A policy. But how old? In 2022, the companion paper to the Lazaridis study, published in the same science issue, was titled "Ancient DNA from Mesopotamia Suggests Distinct Pre-Pottery and Pottery Neolithic Migrations into Anatolia." It contained the first ancient DNA data ever extracted from pre-pottery Neolithic sites in northern Iraq. Nemrik, Kurtik Tepe, sites that were already old when the concept of writing was invented, and the genetic profile of the people who lived in those places. People who were farming and building before any empire existed, clusters nearest to one modern population. Stay with me here, because this is the number that ends the debate. In 2017, a research team led by Dr. Serkan Dogan at the International Birch University in Bosnia, in collaboration with researchers at the University of Salahuddin in Erbil, Iraq, she published a study in PLOS ONE analyzing 500 Y chromosome samples from 5 major ethnic groups across northern Iraq: Arabs, Kurds, Turkmens, Yazidis, and Syriacs, who are the same community as Assyrians. They compared paternal lineages not just among themselves, but against 19 other populations from across the Near East and beyond. The result was stark. The Syriac population differentiated from all 4 other northern Iraqi ethnic groups, not slightly, but categorically, clustering away from Arabs, Kurds, and Turkmens in both dimensions of the MDS analysis. The study found the Syriac paternal lineages showed signs of strong population bottleneck and strict endogamy. The haplogroup R1b alone accounted for 30.23% of the Syriac sample, the single most common lineage in that community. In neighboring Arab communities in the same region, R1b barely registers. Now, think about what that requires. No significant admixture from the Akkadians who came before them. No signal from the Babylonians who conquered them. No trace from the Persians who ruled them next, or the Greeks who Hellenized the region after that. No mark left by the Parthians, the Sassanids, the Arab armies of 637 CE, the Mongols who destroyed Baghdad in 1258, or the Ottoman administration that ran the region for 4 centuries. Every single one of those chapters rewrote someone's DNA in Mesopotamia. None of them rewrote this one. In 720 BCE, Sargon II of Assyria deported the population of the Kingdom of Israel. That event created the legend of the 10 lost tribes. Then the Israelite gene pool was fractured and dissolved across the empire over the following generations. The Assyrian scribes who organized, recorded, and executed that deportation, their male descendants still carry the same Y chromosome lineages today, measurably, traceably, unchanged. The hand that scattered the 10 tribes did not scatter itself. And here is what current genomic modeling places as the origin point for this genetic distinctiveness, not 2600 BCE, not the founding of Asshur as a city. The ancestral component that separates modern Assyrians from all neighboring populations crystallized in the pre-pottery Neolithic. Before writing, before bronze, before the first city walls. The identity that built the first libraries was older than the concept of the library itself. But there is one frequency in that genome that doesn't belong there, one haplogroup that points not to ancient Mesopotamia, but to the steppes. And it arrived at a very specific moment in history, precisely when Assyria was absorbing its most powerful rival, the steppe. That word should not appear in a sentence about Mesopotamia, and yet here we are. R1b-L23, the clade that sits at the root of R1b-Z2103, is a lineage associated with populations that spread westward from the Pontic-Caspian steppe during the Bronze Age, the same ancestral genetic pool that drove the expansion of Indo-European languages across Eurasia. Among Syriacs in northern Iraq, the 2017 PLOS ONE study found R1b at 30.23%, the dominant paternal lineage. Among Assyrians in Iran, specifically the group sampled in Azerbaijan Garbi province, a 2012 study by Dr. Viola Gruni and Dr. Ornella Semino at the University of Pavia, Italy, published in PLOS ONE, found R1b-L23 reaching 29.2% in the averaged Assyrian sample. In neighboring Kurdish communities in the same study, R1b-L23 is negligible. In Arab populations, essentially absent. In Turkmens, absent. Everything I just said about Assyrian genetic stability, hold on to it, because it's about to mean something completely different. The Hurrians. You may not recognize that name, and that is exactly the point. The Hurrians were a non-Semitic, non-Indo-European people who entered northern Mesopotamia from the Armenian highlands around 2300 BCE. They were not minor players. They founded the Mitanni kingdom, which by 1500 BCE controlled the precise geographic heartland of what would become the Assyrian Empire, the Upper Tigris Valley, Shadakabur Triangle, northern Syria. And crucially, ancient DNA from Mitanni-era sites shows elevated R1b-L23 frequencies, the same steppe-linked haplogroup showing up anomalously high in Assyrian men today. The Mitanni kingdom was absorbed by the Assyrian Empire in the 14th century BCE, and when that absorption happened, the Assyrians did not just take the territory. Based on the genetic signal, they appear to have taken the fathers. Near the city of modern Kirkuk in northern Iraq sits the ancient Hurrian administrative center of Nutsi. American excavators from Harvard University and the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago worked that site from 1925 to 1933 and uncovered over 20,000 clay tablets dating to approximately 1500 to 1350 BCE. Among them, Formal adoption contracts. Hurrian men being legally incorporated into Assyrian households, granted Assyrian family standing, made eligible to marry into Assyrian family lines. The bureaucracy that absorbed the Hurrians legally also absorbed them biologically. Actually, if you watched my last video on the Assyrians and what DNA proved about their identity, you already touched the first edge of this puzzle. But we didn't ask the deeper question. If the people history calls Assyrian carry the paternal lineage of a completely different civilization, what does that do to every identity claim built on Assyrian ancestry? Drop your thoughts in the comments, then stay with me, because the answer I'm about to give you is the one that last video was building toward. Here is the uncomfortable part. The Hurrian language died. The Hurrian theology was absorbed into the Assyrian religious canon. The Hurrian political entity was dismantled and erased from the official record. But the Hurrian men, specifically their Y chromosomal lines, did not disappear. They persisted inside a civilization that called itself Assyrian, spoke Akkadian, worshipped Asher, and never once credited the Hurrians with contributing anything except a brief political obstacle. The fathers of the empire were, in their DNA, partially the people the empire erased from its own story. The Hurrians founded an empire, administered a kingdom, generated 20,000 administrative tablets, and were absorbed by a civilization that outlasted them by 2,600 years. They have no named modern descendants. No language carries their name. No country claims their heritage. No ethnic group calls itself Hurrian, except in one place, in the Y chromosome of every Assyrian man alive today. The most completely forgotten civilization in the ancient Near East is, genetically, one of the most present things on Earth. The Hurrians didn't disappear. They became the bloodline of the people who replaced them, and that bloodline is still here, a bloodline preserved. But by what? Not empire, not war. In the 4th century CE, the Assyrian Church of the East formalized endogamous marriage practices, marriage within the community, enforced through canon law and social structure. Marriage to a non-Assyrian required full religious conversion, and conversion required renunciation of your family lineage within the church's community system. In the language of population genetics, a social institution had been converted, involuntarily, and without anyone using that language, into a barrier to gene flow. Faith became a genomic wall, and that wall held for 1,600 years. The genetic signal of this is measurable. The 2017 PLOS ONE study noted that northern Iraqi Syriacs showed the lowest unique haplotype value of the 5 ethnic groups analyzed, only 36.05% unique haplotypes compared to 80.77% for Kurds, a pattern described by the authors as perhaps reflective of the well-documented isolation and strict religious endogamy in this community. When a population isn't mixing with its neighbors, you see it in the data. The haplotypes repeat. The diversity flattens. The wall is visible as a number. But here's where it gets strange, because the wall that preserved them also made them visible. The same religious boundary that sealed the ancient Mesopotamian genome for 16 centuries made Assyrian communities genetically, socially, and geographically legible. You could identify an Assyrian family by surname, by village, by church affiliation, by who they had married for 1,500 years. When Ottoman forces and Kurdish tribal militias began systematically targeting Christian communities starting in 1914, the Church of the East's endogamy had already done the work of drawing the map for them. The wall that preserved the bloodline also made it findable. Preservation and targeting were the same architecture. Mar Shimun, the 19th Benjamin, patriarch of the Hakkari mountain Assyrians, shot at Dilmun under a flag of truce in March 1918. His death triggered the forced displacement of more than 70,000 mountain Assyrians. Estimates presented to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 placed Assyrian deaths between 1914 and 1918 at around 250,000 people, roughly half of the pre-war population. Some later estimates run higher. The Church of the East lost the majority of its congregation in 6 years. A genetic bottleneck leaves a fingerprint, reduced diversity, elevated runs of homozygosity, rare genetic variants appearing at unexpectedly high frequencies across individuals who have no documented relationship. All of those markers are present in modern Assyrian population genetics. The Seyfo, the Assyrian genocide, is not only a historical event recorded in documents. It is written in the genome of every living Assyrian. The shape of what was destroyed is still readable in the DNA of what survived. And here is the inversion that turns this whole narrative upside down. The standard historical framing says the conversion of Assyrians to Christianity in the 1st century CE was a rupture, the old religion broken, the ancient connection severed, a new faith replacing the old world. But the genetic data says the opposite. Christianity preserved the ancient Mesopotamian genome by creating the endogamy mechanism that sealed it. The faith that appeared to break the link to the ancient world was the biological mechanism that maintained it. What history called the ending, the fall of the old religion, the rise of the new, was actually the lock. So, the lock. We have the lock. Mystery solved. A population under sustained external pressure converts to a religion that enforces internal marriage. The gene pool seals. Across 1,600 years, admixture rates drop to near zero. The ancient Mesopotamian genome persists, not through military power, but through faith operating as a biological membrane. It is a clean answer. It is logical. It is supported by data. The mystery has a mechanism, and the episode could end here. Except it can't, because the Church of the East was founded in the 1st century CE, and the Assyrian genetic profile was already stable for at least 2,000 years before the first Assyrian converted to Christianity. There are 3 things this means for the origin story you've been building in this video. The third one is the one that changes everything. First, the Lazarides et al. 2022. Science data shows the northern Mesopotamian genetic profile, the ancestral component most closely associated with modern Assyrians, persisting through the Akkadian Empire, running through the Bronze Age collapse of approximately 1200 BCE, and through the Neo-Assyrian imperial period without detectable admixture from any of the conquering populations. This is ancient DNA covering thousands of years of sampling points. The stability predates the religion by millennia. Second, this means the Christian endogamy explanation, which is real and documented and supported by the PLOS ONE data, did not create the continuity. It maintained something that was already ancient by the time Jesus of Nazareth was born. Third, and here is the thing that should stop you cold, there is a gap, a 2,000-year gap between the Hurrian integration of approximately 1350 BCE and the founding of the Church of the East in the 1st century CE. In population genetics, this kind of undocumented stability has a name, ascertainment bias. Oh, we see the mechanism we can document. We miss the one we can't. Something was maintaining this genome's integrity in 1500 BCE. We do not know what. We do not know who made that decision, or whether it was a decision at all. At Erasure, the ancient Assyrian religious capital on the Tigris, today called Kalat Shirkat in northern Iraq, early 20th century excavations by German archaeologist Walter André, working from 1903 to 1914, found burial practices spanning from the early Bronze Age through the Neo-Assyrian period. The dead were buried beneath the floors of their own homes, generation after generation, in the same physical location, across thousands of years. The bones of the ancestors literally under the feet of their descendants. These people did not move. They did not take other names. And they built the next generation directly over the last one. That physical rootedness is a material reflection of the genetic record, but it raises the question that the endogamy narrative doesn't answer. Who enforced the boundary before the church existed? What was the mechanism between 1350 BCE and the 1st century CE? And why does the one haplogroup that breaks the deep Neolithic pattern, R1b-L23, the steppe lineage, point to a people that Assyria officially erased from its own history? Who let the Hurrians in? And was it a choice? There is a study that might answer this. NSF funded doctoral dissertation research from Binghamton University, documented in federal funding records, designed specifically to test the pre-Christian Assyrian continuity hypothesis using mitochondrial and Y chromosome data from diaspora communities. As the samples were collected, the analysis was designed, the funding record exists. A peer-reviewed publication never appeared. The data that could answer the oldest genetic question in Assyrian studies is sitting on a hard drive somewhere, unpublished, uncited, and silent. Between the samples were collected and the paper was never published, something was decided. Decided. That word matters more than it should. Modern Assyrians are classified as a minority population in Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. 4 countries that collectively administer, in various configurations, the ancestral Assyrian homeland. In Iraq and Syria, Assyrian community leaders have invoked indigenous land rights arguments based on continuous habitation since antiquity, arguments directly supported by the genetic evidence of 10,000 years of documented, immeasurable in-place biological continuity. In Turkey, the word Assyrian does not appear in the official list of recognized ethnic minorities. In Iran, Assyrians are recognized as a religious minority, but claims rooted in territorial antiquity are not recognized alongside them. The genetic proof of their origin is simultaneously the legal argument for their land, and that creates a specific kind of scientific pressure that doesn't look like suppression from the outside. What they chose not to publish next, or more precisely, what they chose not to fully publish, is where this gets serious. The 2017 PLOS ONE study on northern Iraqi paternal lineages sampled 500 individuals from 5 ethnic groups. The Syriac sample was all verified, now completing the script from segment 7, full, uninterrupted, production ready, decided. That word matters more than it should. Modern Assyrians are classified as a minority population in Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. 4 countries that collectively administer, in various configurations, the ancestral Assyrian homeland. In Iraq and Syria, Assyrian community leaders have invoked indigenous land rights arguments built on continuous habitation since antiquity, arguments directly supported by the genetic evidence of 10,000 years of documented, measurable, in-place biological continuity. In Turkey, the word Assyrian does not appear in the official list of recognized ethnic minorities. In Iran, Assyrians are recognized as a religious minority, but claims rooted in territorial antiquity are not recognized alongside them. The genetic proof of their origin is simultaneously the legal argument for their land. So that creates a very specific kind of scientific pressure that doesn't look like suppression from the outside. It just looks like a gap in the published record. What they chose not to fully publish next, or more precisely, what didn't make it into the final tables, is where this becomes serious. The 2017 PLOS ONE study on northern Iraqi paternal lineages sampled 500 individuals from 5 ethnic groups. The Syriac/Assyrian sample produced findings that the authors acknowledged were consistent with strict religious endogamy and population isolation. The study confirmed the Syriac cluster was categorically distinct from all 4 other northern Iraqi groups. But the published data did not separate homeland Assyrians, those still living in the Nineveh plains, from diaspora Assyrians living abroad. Both populations were in the raw sample. The published tables aggregated them. That distinction between a population that never left and a population that did would be the single most informative comparison point for testing pre-Christian genetic continuity. It is not in the published record. Whether that was editorial, methodological, or something else entirely has not been stated publicly. Now, March 5, 2015. ISIS begins the demolition of Nimrud, sledgehammers first, then bulldozers, then explosives. The Lamassu, the winged bull statues at the gates of the palace of Ashur-nasir II, carved in the 9th century BCE, were smashed on camera, live-streamed. By the time Iraqi forces retook the site in late 2016, approximately 90% of the excavated portions of the city had been completely destroyed. Just over 35,000 relics have since been recovered. Most of the in situ architectural evidence, the stratigraphic record that corroborates the genetic record, is gone. The stated justification was iconoclasm. The operational result was the destruction of the primary physical evidence base for Assyrian antiquity in northern Iraq. Think about what that means structurally. The bombs at Nimrud and the unpublished data from that 2017 PLOS ONE study accomplish the same outcome. They make the oldest genetic and archaeological claim in northern Mesopotamia harder to prove in a courtroom, harder to present to a land tribunal, harder to argue in front of a constitutional body. One is an act of violence. One is a publication decision. The result is the same gap in the record, and yet the genome refuses to cooperate with its own erasure. Every new ancient DNA study confirms the same finding. Every new sample from northern Mesopotamia lands nearest the modern Assyrian cluster. A preliminary discussion in academic circles of forthcoming ancient Assyrian samples from Nineveh suggested the Middle Assyrian samples, modeled at approximately 80% Neolithic northern Iraqi ancestry. The pre-publication version of those numbers has since been revised in the draft manuscript. The direction of the revision has not been publicly disclosed. Between the preliminary finding and the forthcoming publication, something was decided. The people whose ancestry is being modeled, 3 to 4 million living Assyrians scattered across diaspora cities from Chicago to Stockholm, have not been told what changed or why, but let's be rigorous. Let's run the hardest argument against everything this video has built. A serious geneticist, and there are several, would say this. The ethnic label Assyrian was not continuously applied to a stable population from 2500 BCE to the present. It was adopted, readopted, reclaimed. The name Assyrian as a self-identifier was popularized largely by Western missionaries and indigenous intellectuals in the 1840s through 1890s among communities who previously called themselves Suriai, Syriac Christians. The modern identity and the ancient empire may share a geographic footprint and a similar genetic cluster without sharing an unbroken conscious identity. The gene pool survived. The claim to it is a modern construction. That argument has real force. Say the genetic continuity between modern Assyrians and ancient Mesopotamians does not automatically prove those modern people are the direct descendants of the Neo-Assyrian imperial class specifically. They could be the descendants of any northern Mesopotamian group that occupied the region continuously, Arameans, post-Mitanni Hurrian remnants, or Neolithic farmers whose lineage never broke, regardless of what empire sat on top of them. The Akkadian-speaking bureaucratic elite of the ancient empire could have been a distinct social layer, one that was genetically different from the rural population that actually survived through the centuries. The counter-argument is not weak, it is precise, and yet, the data said the exact opposite of what that argument requires. Dr. Joseph Lazaridis at Harvard Medical School spent years building the largest ancient genomic dataset of West Eurasia ever assembled. In 2022, his team's science publications included ancient DNA from sites dated specifically to the Middle Assyrian and Neo-Assyrian periods, not just Neolithic sites, but samples from within the imperial era itself. Those samples do not show a distinct social elite with different ancestry sitting on top of a different rural base. The ancient Assyrian era samples cluster with the Neolithic samples that precede them and with the modern Assyrian samples that follow. There is no substitution signal. There is no replacement. The rural farmers and the imperial population and the post-imperial survivors are, genomically, the same people across 6,000 years of sampling points. The counter-argument requires a gap in the ancient DNA record. The record has no gap. And then there is Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza, the most cited human population geneticist of the 20th century. He worked before ancient DNA existed, before we could extract genomes from 10,000-year-old bones. Using only living allele frequencies and the mathematical tools of the 1980s and 1990s, he wrote in The History and Geography of Human Genes, published by Princeton University Press in 1994, that Assyrians are, and I am quoting directly, a fairly homogeneous group of people believed to originate from the land of Old Assyria in northern Iraq. Every ancient DNA study published in the 30 years since has confirmed that judgment. The oldest tool in human genetics and the newest tool of ancient genomics agree on the same point. The Assyrians are who they say they are. The counter-argument collapses, but its collapse leaves something important behind. What it clarifies is exactly what the survival means. The Assyrian genetic lineage did not survive because of empire. The empire ended. It survived because of mountains, because of prayer, because of a social wall built from religious law that nobody realized was also a biological wall, because of an inherited stubbornness, measurable, documented, visible in the data, to not dissolve into the populations pressing in from every direction across 10,000 years of continuous pressure. They survived not as an empire. They survived as something harder than an empire. And now for the finding that should make you stop and sit with it for a moment. When modern Assyrian genomes are plotted against ancient Urartian samples, the Urartians, founders of the kingdom of Van in eastern Anatolia, who were the Assyrian Empire's great northern rival for 2 centuries, The genetic distance between them is smaller than the distance between modern Assyrians and modern Kurds who live in the same villages today. Two civilizations that built competing empires, fought each other's armies, assassinated each other's kings, and wrote propaganda against each other in cuneiform were, in their bones, barely distinguishable. History invented the war. The genome never agreed to it. The Urartians. Here is what history says about them. Dominant regional power from approximately 860 to 585 BCE, founders of the fortress city of Van in eastern Anatolia. They introduced iron smelting techniques to the region, and built an elaborate canal irrigation system, and held the Assyrian Empire to a standstill at the Battle of Uaush in 714 BCE, one of the most significant Assyrian military setbacks of the Neo-Assyrian period. Then, around 585 BCE, they collapsed under Median pressure. And then, nothing. No named modern descendants. No surviving language with traceable roots. No ethnic group that calls itself Urartian. They vanished from history more completely than almost any other major civilization of the ancient Near East. And then, in recent years, ancient DNA from Urartian-era burials near Lake Van was published. The finding is one of those moments where you read the data twice before accepting what it says. The Urartian ancient DNA does not cluster with Iranians. It does not cluster with early Anatolians. It lands, with precision, down between two modern populations, Armenians and Assyrians. The genetic profile of the Neo-Assyrian Empire and the Kingdom of Urartu, two civilizations that spent 2 centuries in open military competition for northern Mesopotamia and eastern Anatolia, are so close that researchers describe them as representing a shared northern Mesopotamian core population. The enemies shared a common genetic substrate. Their political differentiation was real. Their biological differentiation, on the scale that ancient DNA can measure, was not. 2 civilizations, 1 genome, written in the bones of rivals. Now, think about what happened next. The Urartians collapsed in 585 BCE. The Armenians emerge as a documented ethnic identity in the historical record from roughly the 6th century BCE onward in the same geographic area. Then ancient DNA from early Armenian samples clusters near the Urartian material. Modern Armenians carry elevated R1b-L23 frequencies, the same step-linked haplogroup elevated in Assyrian men. The Armenian Apostolic Church, like the Assyrian Church of the East, formalized endogamy practices that maintained genetic boundaries across centuries of conquest. The parallel is not approximate. It is structural, measurable, and exact. The most forgotten empire in the ancient Near East, the Hurrians, absorbed into Assyria, persists in Assyrian Y chromosomes. The second most forgotten empire, Urartu, absorbed into history as Proto-Armenians, persists in the Armenian genome. 2 erasures, 2 survivors. The same genetic neighborhood, the same mechanism of preservation through religious endogamy under sustained outside pressure. Dr. The Lazaridis and his team's 2022 Southern Arc data captured both populations in the same ancient genomic framework. The data shows the northern Mesopotamian and eastern Anatolian highland zone as a single genetic region that produced multiple named civilizations, Hurrian, Urartian, Assyrian, Armenian, which rose and fell as political entities, while the underlying biology remained continuous. The empires were the costumes. The genome was the body wearing them. And here is the part that has not been resolved. The Assyrians and Armenians, who share the highest genetic affinity among all modern populations, who share the Hurrian paternal haplogroup signal, who share the endogamy mechanism, who share the Seyfo, live today in 2 completely different political circumstances. Armenians have a country. Assyrians do not. The genetic evidence for both populations' antiquity in their homelands is equally strong. The political recognition of that evidence is not equal at all. The data is identical. The outcome is not. And nobody has explained why the same genome in 2 different communities produced 2 different fates. Here is what the genome cannot tell you. It cannot tell you what it feels like to be genetically continuous with a civilization that no living government will acknowledge. It cannot tell you what happens to a people when the most powerful proof of their origin, ancient DNA, peer-reviewed, published in Science, covering 10,000 years of unbroken biological continuity, exists in a journal that no land court, no constitutional body, no UN recognition process is currently required to accept. The data is there. The mechanism that produced it is there. The wall that preserved it, mountains, faith, endogamy, suffering, is documented and measurable. None of that has produced a country. None of that has produced a protected homeland. None of that has stopped the land seizures in the Nineveh plains, documented in 2026 by the Assyrian Aid Society, where agricultural fields with legal deed records have been reclassified or seized through administrative pressure, quietly, without international coverage. There are approximately 3 to 4 million Assyrians alive today, the most genetically continuous population in the ancient Near East, the baseline Mesopotamian reference genome that scientists use to calibrate all other ancient Middle Eastern DNA. The closest living relatives of the people who built the first libraries, who deported the 10 tribes, who recorded civilization's earliest administrative acts on clay tablets that are now in London and Chicago and Berlin. They are scattered across diaspora cities. Their ancestral villages are being emptied, not by ancient conquest this time, but by bureaucratic pressure, economic strangulation, and the quiet arithmetic of a population that has nowhere guaranteed to return to. The genome survived the Babylonians. It survived the Persians. It survived Alexander and the Parthians and the Sassanids and the Arab conquests and the Mongols and the Ottomans and the Seyfo. It survived ISIS and the demolition of Nimrud and the loss of the Lamassu and the unpublished studies and the revised pre-publication data. What the genome cannot survive, what no genome can survive, is the disappearance of the people who carry it. The people who carry this genome are disappearing, slowly, administratively, without a single battle, without a single headline. The Assyrian Church of the East baptismal record from Urmia, the Nutsi adoption tablet in Chicago, the Hakkari MTDN study sitting in an academic archive, the NSF dissertation data on a hard drive, the pre-publication Nineveh findings before they were revised, the PCA coordinate that puts Nadia's genome at 9,800 BCE. All of it points to the same thing. All of it says the same thing. All of it has been saying the same thing for 10,000 years, and the world keeps deciding not to hear it.